years ago. I will confess, I did not finish it. I don't know if this happens to you, but you get distracted, you get waylaid, and you start on another book. And I read a few chapters of it, but I was reminded again of it this week as I prepared for the message. This is a story. The author, Paul, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. I'm going to say Kalanithi. In 2013, he was completing his medical residency. He's on his way to becoming a neurosurgeon at Stanford University. He was on the fast track, we might say. And then he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And he had just turned 36. And so he begins to write. And his memoir is eventually published as this book, When Breath Becomes Air. And in the book, he recites some words that his oncologist and friends shared with him as he wrestled with his impending death. And his oncologist said to him, "This is not the end or even the beginning of the end. This is just the end of the beginning." Kalanithi died in March of 2015, 8 months after the birth of his only child, and he died in the same hospital in which she had been born. He was raised in a Christian home. He talks about how he strayed from the faith, actually considered himself an atheist at one point, but in his final years seemed to have found God again. But the words of his oncologist, I think, ring true in light of the gospel. For those of us who follow Jesus, we can relate to these words because we would say death is not the end. Death is not even the beginning of the end. Death is simply the end of the beginning. It is the beginning of eternity. And maybe while most of us intellectually believe this to be true, deep down it's a harder struggle, isn't it? We avoid death, we don't like talking about death, and maybe that reveals our avoidance of death, our reluctance to talk about death, even our own death. Maybe that reveals more of what is really in our beliefs. An American anthropologist has observed the end of life has become so medicalized that death is often viewed as a failure rather than an expected stage of life. Just think about how often we talk about when someone passes away. We say they lost the fight, they lost their battle. It's a failure, right? And that's in contrast to, for example, when Paul writes in 2 Timothy 4:7 about his impending death. He's expecting to be executed by the Romans. He talks about not failing, not losing the battle, but finishing the race. Our cultural fixation on pleasure, on everything good, has conditioned us to ignore, to deny, even to try to subvert death. And as a result, we don't think about it very deeply. We don't ponder it. We don't look on it. And we forget the words of the psalmist that we are to number our days. We are to think about our limitations, the finitude of this life. All that to say this. In a few weeks, we will be at Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. And there's a real temptation as we look towards that day to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. Obviously, it's not a temptation. That's the reality of Easter Sunday, right? We celebrate the resurrection of Christ. But very often, we jump to that without confronting the reality of death. We fail to confront the reality that as human beings, we are dust. That as human beings, all of us here unless the Lord returns, all of us here will die. It was 2 years ago this week, 2 years ago this Sunday, more or less, that COVID began shutting things down, including our time together. COVID shut down all sorts of things, physically, mentally, spiritually. Some of them have reopened. Some have not reopened spiritually, physically, mentally. And part of the hardest times during COVID, and some of you have experienced this, have been the loss of loved ones. A time when mourning was restricted in so many ways. Gatherings were a challenge. Confronting death, even harder in the past couple of years. But you know, as we look towards Easter Sunday, we have to get there by the way of the cross. Before we arrive at the resurrection, we have to confront the cross. We have to consider death. And confronting the cross, considering the depth of Jesus' love that led him to die for me, to die for you, to die for the whole world. That is something that really can leave us at a loss of words. I mean, how do you talk about that? How do you describe that? And that's one of the great things about music. That's why singing and the songs that we sing are so valuable. Singing, even the physical act of singing, they talk about how singing is uses a different part of our brain. I can't remember if it's the right or left, but it uses a different part of our brain. It's known that people who suffer from dementia, suffer from Alzheimer's, one of the things they don't forget is their music, right? And so God has given us this gift. God has given us the gift of music, of hymns and songs. And one of the gifts of hymns and songs, like the psalmists, like the Psalms, is that they provide us with words when our own words feel so meager, so inadequate. And especially when it comes to talking about what's the cross about? What does Christ's love and his willingness to die for me, how do I describe that? And they have a rich language which gives voice to that response that we have in our souls that we may not be able to articulate about the sacrifice and the love of Christ. And so this morning and next Sunday, I want to look at some songs of the cross, as I've labeled them, and to think about some of the hymns. These will be familiar hymns to us. But as we sing and contemplate them, they can help us enter into the meaning of Christ's sacrifice. We do that every Sunday, right? We have a hymn before communion that helps us focus on what we remember at this table. And these hymns express the good news that reverberates even in the darkest moments of Jesus' suffering, even in the darkest moments of his death, and even in the darkest moments of our own lives. And so I want to begin this morning with this very familiar hymn. This is number 315. If you have, there's a hymnal in the seat in front of you on the lower. Turn to number 315 in our hymnals. And this is Isaac Watts's piece, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. You might want to keep that open. We'll be singing it at the end and as we look at this hymn. Watts was son of a schoolmaster. He was born in Southampton, England, back in 1674, so that makes him older than all of us here. He wrote his first hymn when he was just 20 years old. And I've seen different numbers. I've seen one source that said the number of his hymns, published hymns, are about 800. Another source said about 600. So let's say his published hymns number between 600 and 800 hymns that he penned. And this hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, I don't know if in our hymnals, if it has a date, does it have the date on it? 1707. Sorry, I need to find my page here. Yeah, it does have it. Written in 1707, and probably the most well-known of all the hymns that he wrote. It was originally composed as a communion hymn, and that is typically how it's used today. Sometimes the use of hymns is changed over time. And at least part of the inspiration for the lyrics come from Paul's words in Galatians chapter 6, verse 14. May I never boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, through which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. And the clearest parallel, I think, comes to that verse, comes in the first line of the second verse. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. Now, when you hear the word survey, when you see the title of this hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, oftentimes when we talk about surveying, we're thinking, well, there is a very technical, very professional use of that term, right? Now, we have surveyors who survey. Sometimes we think the word survey in more technical terms. But actually, in this hymn, what Watts is trying to get us to do is not survey in a technical sense. He's trying to get us to contemplate. When I contemplate the wondrous cross. So this surveying the cross isn't a mechanical, morbid lurking. This is an invitation. It's an invitation to contemplate death. To go back to what I was talking about at the beginning, something we are not comfortable doing. To contemplate death, and according to the hymn, to begin the journey toward clarity. Looking upon the cross, contemplating the cross, clarifies what is truly important, clarifies what really matters as we consider what is to come, what faces each and every one of us, and what awaits us beyond this life. And so Watts starts with contemplation of the cross and the fact, what does he say? All of our worldly achievements, all of our possessions pale in comparison to the cross. And then he shows that Christ went to the cross, and he talks about the depth of his love for us. And I think, for me, this is the most powerful image of the hymn, where he affirms both the divinity of Christ who is suffering on the cross. He is God on the cross. But he does it with this brilliant juxtaposition. Did ere such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown? And the last verse shows that the only proper response to that amazing love is complete devotion. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. The original title that Watts gave to this hymn was a little longer. It was Crucifixion to the World by the Death of Christ. And you can see that theme in this hymn, right? The theme of dying to the world and to the earthly longings. When we come to the cross, it's in the hymn in these words: "My richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood." And one of the original stanzas that we don't sing anymore, it was eliminated from later editions of the hymn, had these words: "Then am I dead to all the globe, and all the globe is dead to me." We don't really know why this line was dropped. Some think that Watts eliminated the stanza, maybe because he wanted to focus more on our attention. He wanted to focus more attention on our response to Christ's crucifixion rather than the crucifixion itself. But the cross is the great revealer. The cross exposes the temporary stuff in this world. The cross directs our minds and our hearts towards the everlasting substance of eternity. The cross upends all of our value systems as human beings. And this is what he gets at in this hymn: worldly riches, pride in our self-sufficiency, vain pursuits, all of these things, all of these and more lose their allure, lose their shine in the shadow of the cross. And as our gaze begins to shift away from the deception of the pleasures of this life and all of the things that try to get our attention in this world, and our gaze shifts towards the cross of Christ, we see sorrow and love flow mingled down. And we're faced with the question: did e'er such love and sorrow meet? Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen thorns that compose so rich a crown? As you look at his head, his hands, his feet, and sorrow and love flowing. And eventually, we're compelled towards the reality that a love so amazing, a love so divine, demands soul, life, and all. Secularism tells us that ultimately there's just two things: there's life and there's death, and that's it. And our lone option is to make the most of the first one, make the most of life, revel in life, before eventually and inevitably succumbing to death. And our culture around us is very ready to do that. It offers us temporary pleasures. It wants to keep our eyes focused on all the shallowy versions of the present. And that's dangerous because, as the poet William Blake said, we become what we behold. We become what we behold. And if as Christians we behold, if as Christians we can contemplate the cross, that is one way that we can break free from the short-sightedness of secularism. That is one way that we can break free and live more fully into the hopeful eternal story that is unfolding in the present and awaiting us in the future. The American novelist, short story writer Flannery O'Connor was reflecting on the death of her father, and she wrote these words in her journal. She said, "The reality of death has come upon us, and a consciousness of the power of God has broken our complacency like a bullet in the side." That's why the cross is so powerful. We're reminded not only of our certain demise, but also, maybe more importantly, what really matters. Maybe we've learned a bit of that in the last couple of years. Maybe we've learned in the last couple of years that what we thought really mattered doesn't. Or maybe we were surprised to learn the things that we really did think mattered when we thought that we didn't think that way. What truly matters. And we're reminded when we look at the cross, we're reminded that all of this, everything that we enjoy, everything that God has blessed us with, and I don't want to come across as denigrating God's beautiful creation. We are thankful. We are thankful for what God has given us, thankful for our lives, thankful for the breath that we have. But it's transitory. It's fleeting. It's all, if I can use the favorite word of the preacher in Ecclesiastes, it's all havel. Translated, it's all vapor. It's all mist. It's all here and then gone. That's the favorite phrase of the writer of Ecclesiastes. It's all havel. And that's actually a gift that the cross gives us. The gift of an accurate, spot-on scale to measure with precision and perspective the values that we hold dear. How do they line up? How do they measure when we weigh them against the cross? What truly matters? What doesn't? Last fall, a seminary professor by the name of Jerry Breshears was diagnosed with cancer again. And he shared the news to his friends and family with these words, this reminder: Jesus is in the present. Look for him. He is easy to miss. I think what he was trying to say is that even though the future can seem full of what ifs, right? What if, maybe, in reality, the story has already been written. The story is already finished because of the cross. We know how this ends. We know how this ends. And the steadfastness of people, of believers like Jerry Breshears, amidst suffering, even facing death, comes because they have a cross-shaped vision of life, a cross-shaped vision of eternity. And it guides them. It's a vision that is only acquired through deep and constant surveying, contemplating the cross. Isn't this, I don't know if it's ever occurred to you, but isn't it weird that the symbol of the Christian faith, I say weird in a kind of a, not a weird, but it's strange, might be a better. Isn't it strange that the symbol of the Christian faith over millennia has always been the cross? Not the empty tomb, which is a much more positive, much more uplifting picture, isn't it? But the cross. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe it's because we're constantly called to contemplate, to have that cross-shaped vision. That's a vision that reveals to us the crucified, resurrected, and ascended Christ is here with us now. He is guiding us today toward a future where there will be no more tears, no more mourning or crying or pain. Paul puts it this way in writing to Christians in Rome. He says, if we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. And for this very reason, to live and to die to the Lord. Christ died and returns to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. There's no fear, no anxiety, no doom, no gloom. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. The cross has erased all of that. This ancient instrument of death that has now become the greatest emblem, symbol of life to the full, now and forever. In one of his later poems, the English poet George Herbert described how time and mortality was once an executioner. You think of the march of time, and you know, you lose time, you lost that time, and time was and mortality was once an executioner. Mortality. But in light of Christ's coming, time and mortality, I won't use his ancient, or not his ancient, his old English language, but he puts it, time and eternity is now a gardener. It's now a gardener. It's planting. Why do we contemplate the cross? Why do we survey the cross? We survey the cross because it declares that death has been disarmed. It's no longer an executioner. It no longer ends our story. The cross is now a gardener. It tills the fertile soil from which resurrection life rises. So you're baptized into the death of Christ, and you're risen up from the waters of baptism to walk in newness of life. And even as you begin this Christian life, the cross is overshadowing you and is with you until the moment you close your eyes this side of eternity. As we survey the wondrous cross, we come to know these words. This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. This is just the end of the beginning.